Texas Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett is about to drop a truth bomb on the comically corrupt Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas.
Listen, Clarence Thomas is corrupt. End of story. I mean, nobody gets this kind of money and isn't influenced in any way. That is where we stand, and that is why the American public is outraged at this court right now because of the likes of Clarence Thomas. But it's about tying in repro to the Supreme Court, tying in guns to the Supreme Court, tying in diversity, equity, and inclusion to the Supreme Court, LGBTQIA, as well as climate change. All of these issues, when we see the decimation of them, they're at the hands of this rogue court.
Tying in real-world issues that affect voters directly to the actions of members of the Supreme Court is exactly why Crockett has become a favorite. She's indeed one of the most promising congresspersons currently in office. Crockett tells it like it is, including that it's extremely easy to buy and sell anyone involved in politics. And by now, we know certain SCOTUS justices are not above it. Justice Thomas has been living his best unearned life for years. His multi-million-dollar grift is as morally bankrupt as they come. In a recent Hill article, they compiled data by Fix the Court. Since 2004, Thomas has accepted more than $4 million in gifts. They believe Thomas accepted nearly 200 gifts, but only reported 27. While he's being wined and dined by a powerful Republican billionaire, consider what influence at the highest levels means to your life. We can't pretend the gun lobby and gun manufacturers did not influence the Supreme Court's bump stock decision. Crockett has been sounding the alarm on Supreme Court corruption for months now. But this interview, it comes on the heels of a scathing Democratic House Oversight Committee meeting pushing for stricter and more robust ethics guidelines for justices.
One of the things that we have heard over and over and over, especially this term, is this idea of a two-tier justice system. We have heard that term used, I don't know how many times.
We suspect there is a two-tier justice system in the United States for Trump supporters that are charged for January 6th and letting catch and release. It's basically catch and release for Antifa and BLM rioters that have rioted and destroyed cities and hurt businesses and looted.
They actively pursue individuals based on their ideological beliefs, specifically targeting Donald Trump, who pose a significant threat to the political left. Some describe this as a two-tier system of justice, but what it really is, it's a system deliberately and systematically prosecuting individuals within the Trump orbit due to their hatred for President Trump.
I think the biggest lesson, Steve, is that Donald Trump has exposed the flank of the deep state and their number one weapon, which has been a two-tier system of justice. The lawfare that they have utilized to try to kneecap President Trump and unconstitutionally imprison him and keep him off the campaign trail is actually backfiring due to Trump's genius and his ability to relay to everyday Americans that this two-tier system of justice sponsored by the deep state is a reality. It is not a right-wing conspiracy theory, and they are coming for everyday Americans' freedoms.
Proof there's no shame comes in the way of MAGA absurdly claiming there's a two-tiered system of justice in our country that somehow disenfranchises them, Trump supporters. Just look at January 6th, the ones that were caught, and let's stop pretending that so many were. They didn't get sentences that rose to the level of insurrection, and not all expressed remorse, even joining that off-key J6 choir. It's a joke. If you're privileged in America, Black and brown folks certainly aren't laughing. Even members of Trump's administration who rode the racism, COVID spreading, misogynistic train have faced not nearly public rebuke. In fact, members of the media are paying them on The View, CNN, other networks as pundits, hair, makeup, glam, Trump experts. What the hell do they need to explain to us? We watched it in real time. We lived it. The bar is so low for some, starting to see what they mean about unfairness.
Would you agree with me that there is some form of ethics that is in place for our lower courts that somehow is absent from our high court?
That is correct.
In the case of what has been laid out by so many of my colleagues as it relates to potential conflicts because your wife is potentially one of the perpetrators of January 6th or one of the planners of January 6th. And also, obviously, we've dealt with the upside down flags that are a sign of solidarity with those same January 6th defendants. What type of recourse do we have when there is a conflict that exists? And when I say conflict, I just want to be very real about this. There are people that have never been anywhere near a law school that are saying even a blind man can see there's an obvious conflict. But what is the recourse on the Supreme Court? Is there a recourse on the Supreme Court when a justice decides that they are not going to recuse themselves from what seems to be a very obvious conflict?
At the moment, there is not.
Okay. So I agree that there may be some sort of a two-tier justice system that is playing out in our country. But it seems like the two-tier justice system is inuring to the benefit of the highest court in the land, from what I can ascertain. Obviously, we're not doing this in a full committee hearing because the people that are running the madhouse right now are not here for it. But we are, because we believe in law and order and overall rule of law. And so when we talk about things such as expanding the court, is there a history in this country of expanding the Supreme Court?
There is. It has been done by Congress.
It has been done by Congress at least 7 different times. And the last time was in 1869. Now, I know that this isn't necessarily your area of expertise, but would you agree with me that this country has grown just a little bit since 1869?
The population has considerably increased, yes.
Okay. So
we can agree on that.
It may make sense to do that. In addition to that, as someone who's practiced in state court and federal court, term limits exist in some form in a number of state court systems, but we don't have it on the federal level. Can you explain to us how potentially imposing term limits on the Supreme Court could allow for hopefully some of the harm that we see coming through the court, some of the terrible influence to hopefully finally make its way out of the court?
Term limits for the court would, among other things, allow for a regular schedule of vacancies so that the court is not driven by the random fact of who the president is at a time when a vacancy emerges. And it would take away, or maybe not entirely take away, but make far less creditable the effort that was done to stop Merrick Garland and install Justice Gorsuch in his place. So it would make it far more regular and ordinary, and it would make it more difficult for partisan justices to time their departure from the court to make sure that their party gets to fill the vacancy. They claim to be completely apolitical, but they seem to try to clear out in the presidency of their own party. So
absolutely. Thank you so much.
And someone forgot Crockett is a lawyer.
I rise today to introduce articles of impeachment against Associate Justices of the Supreme Court Clarence Thomas and Samuel Anthony Alito, Jr. Against Justice Thomas, the resolution includes 3 total articles: 1 count of failure to disclose financial income, gifts, reimbursements, property interest liabilities, and transactions, among other information, and 2 counts of refusal to recuse from matters concerning his spouse's legal and financial interests before the court.
2 Democratic senators, Sheldon Whitehouse of Rhode Island and Ron Wyden of Oregon, sent a letter to Attorney General Merrick Garland asking him to appoint a special counsel to investigate likely undisclosed gifts and income from Thomas's known friend and associate billionaire Harlan Crow and other donors. The senators alleged that Thomas may have committed tax fraud by accepting and failing to disclose gifts worth potentially millions of dollars. So we already know about Harlan Crow. That was a huge headline when the connection between Crow and Thomas was first reported. But the problem isn't necessarily the gifts themselves. As Thomas said, many of the gifts were personal hospitality from close friends. It's understandable that when you're a Supreme Court justice, you would have friends in higher places, friends like Harlan Crow. The problem is the fact that he, a law practitioner at the absolute top of his field, failed to disclose the gifts properly, if at all. In the letter from the senators, they disclose a list of likely undisclosed gifts and income from Harlan Crow and affiliate companies and other donors. Most notably, it's been revealed that Thomas allegedly took a yacht trip to Russia and the Baltics, which included a helicopter ride to Yusupov Imperial Palace in St. Petersburg back in 2003. St. Petersburg also happens to be Vladimir Putin's hometown, but there are no details as to what Thomas was doing at the palace or who he met with. As far as how he may have gotten away with keeping this trip concealed for over 20 years, Ukrainian-American activist Igor Sushko posits that Thomas likely entered and exited Russia on an oligarch's yacht in the Gulf of Finland, so his U.S. passport wouldn't have a record of visiting Russia. In the request for the investigation, the senators said this: "We do not make this request lightly. The evidence assembled thus far plainly suggests that Justice Thomas has committed numerous willful violations of federal ethics and false statement laws and raises significant questions about whether he and his wealthy benefactors have complied with their federal tax obligations. Presented with opportunities to resolve questions about his conduct, Justice Thomas has maintained a suspicious silence. No government official should be above the law. We therefore request that you appoint a special counsel authorized to investigate potential criminal violations by Justice Thomas." They also mentioned that the full scope of these non-disclosures is still unknown.
So the bad news is that we have a rogue court that has been captured by special interests and that is over and over again in appalling pattern continuing to follow the direction of the billionaires and the front group through which they operate. The good news is that the public is fed up. Congress is fed up, mostly. And the Judicial Conference is beginning to tighten up the rules on the Supreme Court justices.
Will the impeachment work? It's highly unlikely. There is no reason for Republican congresspeople in either the House or the Senate to vote to remove a conservative justice from the bench. And we already know how the Supreme Court, with a few notable exceptions, feels about bribes, or gratuities as they call it. With the current system, there is no incentive for Thomas or Alito to step down from their positions, and if they don't do it themselves, who's going to make them? They already seem immune to public pressure because usually they're the ones issuing judgment on other similarly embroiled officials. They're so well protected on that bench that they hardly even demonstrate remorse whenever allegations such as these turn up. What's the point? They don't need to curry favor with the public. We didn't vote for them. They're never going to run a re-election campaign. We pay their salaries, but only because we don't have much of a choice in the matter. There is very little that we can do to them. But the president could do something if he really wanted to, if it was justified. He hasn't yet, but he could. And if it wasn't already completely obvious that there needed to be some kind of reformation of the Supreme Court, it's pretty clear now. At the very absolute least, can we at least just get rid of these lifetime appointments? And sure, appoint the special counsel, run the probe, file the articles, do the due diligence, and then do something actually meaningful at the end of it all. This government is completely unsustainable with one of its three branches completely rogue. And that's not to say that the other two branches are in fine working order at the moment, but if the 21st century has taught us anything, it's that our systems are not impenetrable, they are not infallible, they are prone to corruption, and they need to be strengthened.